I look like a good babysitter because I look nice, but not quite hot enough to ruin a marriage. Yeah. In fact, if you're married and your husband comes home and he makes you breakfast in bed 3 days in a row, it's because he just had sex with me and was like, I need to make this marriage work. I don't wreck marriages, I strengthen them.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, February the 29th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Ayn Rand, Bishop Barron, the 33 strategies of war, and Inside Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Wenn der Führer says, he is the master race, be higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so be higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. When Herr Goebbels says, we own the world in space, be higher, higher, right in Herr Goebbels' face. When Herr Göring says, they'll never bomb this place, be higher, higher, right in Herr Göring's face. Are we not the Superman? Aryan pure Superman? Yeah, here's the Superman. Super duper Superman. Is this Nazi land so good? Would you leave it if you could? Yeah, this Nazi land is good. We would leave it if we could. We bring the world new order. Heil Hitler's world new order. Everyone a foreign race. We love the pure space. When we bring to the world disorder. When the Führer says he is the master race, we higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so be higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. When the Führer says he is the master race, be higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so be higher, higher, right in the Führer's face.
Thank you. And now a little bit of Mafia action.
Michael Francese's a former mob boss and author of Mafia, Democracy. All right, Mike, how entrenched is the whole kickback thing in the inner city?
Well, Jesse, I got to tell you this. The most encouraging thing that came out of this investigation was the fact that the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office, at least in Manhattan, is investigating somebody other than Donald Trump. That's
Right.
Good news.
Right.
But I got to tell you, they said this investigation is going back 10 years. It should be going back 50 years because this was commonplace when I was on the street in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it was almost a joke with the New York City Housing Authority that we put contractors to work. They were taking money. But you know what's got me on this It used to be a little bit more discreet, but when you have 70 people, I couldn't believe that number. 70 people means that this is systemic through the entire agency, that they must be talking about this, laughing about this, joking about this. And my question is, who's minding the store? I mean, this is so out of control. It wasn't like that in my day. We always were bribing these people. That wasn't, uncommon at all. But to have this amount of people on the take,
and Mike,
imagine how many contractors are on the street that know about this,
Mike,
and nobody cares.
They didn't have cell phones back then either. So when you were giving a guy 50 grand and he only made 80 grand a year, he wasn't going to Venice and popping bottles and posting it on Instagram.
Yeah, bragging about it. I mean, it's gotten so out of hand. Jesse, this is commonplace. I mean, we had politicians all the time that were on the take. I think I told you last time, I had 18 licenses that were licensed to collect the tax on every gallon of gasoline, and I couldn't get them on my own. I was paying a very high-powered, he was actually a Democratic leader in New York at that time, and I was paying him to get the licenses. And he knew exactly what we were doing, that we were taking money off the government, that we were defrauding them out of tax money. But, look, politicians, when you got votes and you got cash to put in their pocket, it's almost systemic. And I don't want to say that everybody is doing it, but so many of them were back then. And now it's gotten so out of hand. I can't even believe that these people get on television, get on their cell phones, they brag about it,
Sure.
They talk about it.
And Mike,
who's minding the store?
We have stories all the time. We hear about people passing around cash for ballots. We're going to do a story in a couple minutes about, we just cooked this one guy down in AC. It was just all over the place. Did you find that when you were on the streets on election day, that type of shenanigan?
Absolutely. Jesse, there's so much grift like this going on. There's so many payoffs. Every time also I see that, a politician is creating a government agency, it's another joke. It's just an opportunity for them to steal. I said it. I entitled my book that, Mafia Democracy. It's gotten so out of hand. When I look and see what's going on now, I just hope people wake up to this and they see what's going on, because it's so out of hand. And I don't understand. Look, just as a citizen, I don't understand, and maybe somebody can explain it to me, how we ever get out from under $33 trillion in debt, and taxpayers keep paying money for ridiculous programs. They use this money, politicians do, they waste it, they throw it away. Now what's going on with all these illegal immigrants, how taxpayers are paying for this. I don't know how American people stand for this anymore.
Yeah,
I really don't.
I don't either. They're just going to keep printing money, raising taxes, and the grift's never going to stop. I'm glad we're peering back behind the curtain a little bit, though. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Or maybe someone's going to fall off a truck. You never know. Mike, thanks so much. Got the book out, Mafia Democracy. Everybody go check it out on Amazon. And while you're there, go check out my one, Get It Together, also available for pre-order. Hey, Sean Hannity here.
And that was a little bit of the Mafia action. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the patriotic shorts.
He had been dropped by his agent and was desperate for any acting jobs. Though broad-shouldered and ruggedly handsome, he was still green in front of the camera and on the verge of quitting Hollywood. He was Clint Eastwood, and fate intervened when TV's newest superstar, James Garner, picked his headshot out of a pile and cast him as the villain in an episode of Maverick. It was just the showcase Eastwood needed, and it soon landed him the role of Rowdy Yates in Rawhide, his breakthrough role. The two bonded over their military service and became fast friends, though they wouldn't work together again for 4 decades, when Eastwood reached out to Garner, who was suffering from health issues, and cast him in Space Cowboys, a film he was directing. It rejuvenated Garner's sagging career, and he would remain busy until his death in 2014. I wouldn't be here were it not for Jimmy Garner, a tearful Eastwood eulogized his friend. His generosity made my career.
They put our ship in dry dock. So I had a friend of mine who lived right near the shipyard. And I said to him, I'm going to go AWOL, but I want you to call me. If they come out of dry dock, I'll come back. So I get home. My house was about a mile and a half from the subway where I got off. I ran all the way home. I wanted to see my mother. My father was at work. My brother was away. My kid brother was in school. I didn't know what to do. I went next door. The woman's name was Mrs. Barsha. And I said, Mrs. Barsha, Where's my mother? She's at the church rolling bandages. So I ran to the church. It was about a mile and a half away. And I opened the door. It was like a big gymnasium. My mother had her back to me. She turned around. She saw me. Fainted dead away. I thought I killed my mother.
He was flying his first combat mission as a navigator on a B-17 bomber. He hadn't turned 19 yet, but he had an uneasy feeling all morning. It was April 21st, 1945, and the weather was brooding and ominous, nothing but dark clouds across the horizon. He was Lieutenant James Bowling, and he expected the mission to be called off, but it wasn't. At 20,000 feet, pilot Frank Bell became disoriented through the cloud cover, and they fell out of formation. It was then that Bowling, a man of deep faith, heard a voice. "Jump," it whispered to him. At that moment, the plane stalled and entered a spin. "Jump," the voice came back louder. Bowling shouted, "Abandon ship," but nobody followed. Bowling jumped, his parachute floating him gently to the ground. Just seconds after leaving the plane, a crack reverberated through the air. The plane had exploded from anti-aircraft fire. All but 3 of the crew would perish, and James Bowling carried a lifetime of survivor's guilt.
When the Medal of Honor was presented to me, I really did not know what it was. Even though the words may have been mentioned somewhere along the way by my commanding general, I still didn't know what it was. I had never seen one, never heard tell of it. And the day that President Truman presented it to me, I still had no concept of what it meant or exactly why am I getting this. Why was I selected to receive our nation's highest award when Marines right beside me didn't get home? It was something that took a tremendous amount of adjustment. And I became a public figure at that point that I never dreamed of becoming. I had to live a different life than I ever anticipated.
Joined the service in 1943. Tried to get in early. I enlisted twice. First time they caught me because I had somewhat altered my birth certificate. And I tried to make 5 of 4, 1924 as opposed to 1925. That would made me 18. And so that didn't work. Finally got the word that I'm not in the Corps after I'd already taken my physical and passed.
She was moved by an advertisement that she read in a magazine. "Be a Marine, free a man to fight," was all it said. But it convinced her to enlist in the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve. It was February 18th, 1943, and only a week earlier the Marines had begun recruiting women in order to free up men to go overseas. Her name was Bernice Frankel, and she would spend the duration of the war at the Marine Corps Air Station in Cherry Point, North Carolina, where she worked as a truck driver, dispatcher, and mechanic. By the time she was discharged in September 1945, she had reached the rank of staff sergeant and indicated a desire to attend drama school. The world would come to know her as B. Arthur, iconic star of stage and TV for 5 decades, who shared the small screen with fellow Golden Girl, Betty White, who amazingly was also a World War II veteran. "I am proud to have served my country," said Arthur, shortly before she passed away in 2009.
The 3 fastest fighter jets ever. Almost nobody knows about number 1. At number 3, the F-15 Eagle. In a record-breaking 1977 test flight, the F-15 reached a speed of 1,654 miles per hour, or Mach 2.5. Even today, the Eagle remains the fastest multi-role fighter in the world. Number 2, the MiG-25. Created by Russia, the MiG-25 was designed with a top speed of 1,800 miles per hour. But in 1971, the aircraft was tracked at Mach 3.2, which is about 2,400 miles per hour. However, the speed would have only lasted seconds and the engines were scrapped after the flight. And finally, the fastest fighter jet ever was the YF-12, a variant of the iconic SR-71 Blackbird. This beast was made to maintain a constant speed of 2,000 miles per hour, but sadly the YF-12 never left the prototype stage.
we started saying, how in the hell can we get into this fight? We let the few hairs that we had grow on our cheeks and put on our father's fedoras. And we went down to the recruiting office and we said, we want to join the Army. We're 18. The recruiting sergeant looked at us and said, go home, kid. Come back when you're really 18. I had to wait 2 more years before I finally turned 18, and it was on March 23rd, 1943, before I could apply for the Army. And at that time, you could not volunteer. They had quotas for each city, and when your city got the quota to send so many men to the services, it was October before I was finally called and sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, the infantry school.
Why don't these expensive fighter jets fall off the aircraft carrier in rough seas? The jets are tied down using heavy iron chains. And these things, known as pad-eyes, are attachment points that are scattered around the deck. These cover the entire sides where the jets and helicopters are parked, and each jet is tightly secured using multiple chains. But that's not the only reason. The aircraft themselves have landing gear brakes by default, and the aircraft carrier is surrounded by a small barrier called a scupper, which is roughly 15 centimeters high. However, if there's a storm, the aircraft would be much safer if they were in the hangar below the aircraft carrier deck. But not all of them can fit in there. Even when the USS Kitty Hawk was hit by a typhoon, the planes were still safe. A normal carrier is meant to be able to hold up to 90 aircraft in the hangar, except only 50 can fit properly. The problem is carriers usually carry around 64 aircraft in total, and the number that can fit in the hangar is even lower on smaller carriers. Remember, fighter jets can't swim yet.
The Mi-24 Hind proved notoriously hard to shoot down during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But how would it fare against an F-15? The answer may surprise you. You see, in 2008, during war games between the Hungarian Air Force and the Louisiana National Guard, 10 American F-15s went up against Hungarian Mi-24s and learned firsthand just how deadly these Soviet helicopters can be. While the F-15 has incredible range, speed, and durability and comes equipped with Sidewinder missiles, those features only proved successful at first, after which point the helicopter crews adapted their tactics, using ground cover to hide themselves. From that point on, the Hinds, aided by information from AWACS, successfully outmaneuvered the F-15s again and again. Then came the real kicker. One female Hungarian pilot achieved not 1, but 2 hits from her cannons against the enemy Eagles. Those hits would have no doubt been kills if the helicopters had been fitted out with missiles.
And that was the Patriotic Shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little motivation.
Is anyone happier because you passed his way? Does anyone remember that you spoke to him today? This day is almost over, and its toiling time is through. Is there anyone to utter now a kindly word of you? Did you give a cheerful greeting to the friend who came along? Or a churlish sort of howdy, and then vanished in the throng? Were you selfish, pure, and simple as you rushed along the way? Or is someone mighty grateful for a deed you did today? Can you say tonight, in parting with the day that's slipping fast, that you helped a single brother of the many that you passed? Is a single heart rejoicing over what you did or said? Does a man whose hopes are fading now with courage look ahead? Did you waste the day or lose it? Was it well or sorely spent? Did you leave a trail of kindness or a scar of discontent? As you close your eyes in slumber, do you think that God would say, "You have earned one more tomorrow by the work you did today.
Courage isn't a brilliant dash, a daring deed in a moment's flash. It isn't an instantaneous thing, born of despair with a sudden spring. It isn't a creature of flickered hope, or the final tug at some slipping rope. But it's something deep in the soul of man that is working always to serve some plan. Courage isn't the last resort in the work of life or the game of sport. It isn't a thing that a man can call at some future time when he's apt to fall. If he hasn't it now, he will have it not when the strain is great and the pace is hot. For who would strive for a distant goal must always have courage within his soul. Courage isn't a dazzling light that flashes and passes away from sight. It's a slow, unwavering, ingrained trait, with the patience to work and the strength to wait. It's part of a man when his skies are blue. It's part of him when he has work to do. The brave man never is freed of it. He has it when there is no need of it. Courage was never designed for show. It isn't a thing that can come and go. It's written in victory and defeat, and every trial a man may meet. It is part of his hours, his days, and his years, back of his smiles, and behind his tears. Courage is more than a daring deed. It is the breath of life and a strong man's creed.
Only a dad with a tired face, coming home from the daily race, bringing little of gold or fame, to show how well he has played the game. But glad in his heart that his own rejoice, to see him come, to hear his voice. Only a dad with a brood of 4, one of 10 million men or more, plodding along in the daily strife, bearing the whips and the scorns of life, with never a whimper or pain or hate, for the sake of those who at home await. Only a dad, neither rich nor proud, merely one of the surging crowd, toiling, striving from day to day, facing whatever may come his way, silent whenever the harsh condemn, and bearing it all for the love of them. Only a dad, but he gives his all to smooth the way for his children small, doing with courage stern and grim the deeds that his father did for him. This is the line that for him I pen. Only a dad, but the best of men. Edgar Albert Guest. With doubt and dismay, you are smitten. You think there's no chance for you, son. Why? The best books haven't been written. The best race hasn't been run. The best score hasn't been made yet. The best song hasn't been sung. The best tune hasn't been played yet. Cheer up, for the world is young. No chance? Why, the world is just eager for things that you want to create. Its store of true wealth is still meager. Its needs are incessant and great. It yearns for more power and beauty, more laughter and love and romance, more loyalty, labor and duty. No chance. Why, there's nothing but chance. For the best verse hasn't been rhymed yet. The best house hasn't been planned. The highest peak hasn't been climbed yet. The mightiest rivers aren't spanned. Don't worry and fret, faint-hearted. The chances have just begun. For the best jobs haven't been started. The best work hasn't been done. By Burton Braley. To live as gently as I can. To be, no matter where, a man. To take what comes of good or ill, and cling to faith and honor still. To do my best and let that stand, the record of my brain and hand. And then, should failure come to me, still work and hope for victory. To have no secret place wherein I stoop unseen to shame or sin. To be the same when I'm alone as when my every deed is known. To live undaunted, unafraid of any step that I have made. To be without pretense or sham. Exactly what men think I am. To leave some simple mark behind. To keep my having lived in mind. If enmity to aught I show. To be an honest, generous foe. To play my little part nor whine. That greater honors are not mine. This, I believe, is all I need for my philosophy and creed. By Edgar Albert Guest.
And that was a little motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the Daily Law for February the 29th.
February 29th. Take the hacker approach. Each age tends to create a model of apprenticeship that is suited to the system of production that prevails at the time. We are now in the computer age, and it is the hacker approach to programming that may offer the most promising model for this new age. The model goes like this. You want to learn as many skills as possible, following the direction that circumstances lead you to, but only if they are related to your deepest interests. Like a hacker, you value the process of self-discovery. You avoid the trap of following one set career path. You are not sure where this will all lead, but you are taking full advantage of the openness of information, all of the knowledge about skills now at our disposal. You see what kind of work suits you and what you want to avoid at all cost. You move by trial and error. You are not wandering about because you are afraid of commitment, but because you are expanding your skill base and your possibilities. At a certain point, when you are ready to settle on something, ideas and opportunities will inevitably present themselves to you. When that happens, all of the skills you have accumulated will prove invaluable. You will be the master at combining them in ways that are unique and suited to your individuality. Daily Law. In this new age, those who follow a rigid, singular path in their youth often find themselves in a career dead end in their 40s or overwhelmed with boredom. The wide-ranging apprenticeship will yield the opposite, expanding possibilities. Mastery Chapter 2. Submit to reality, the ideal apprenticeship.
And that was the Daily Law for February the 29th from the Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The hybrid quality of the human being is key to a lot of our poetry and a lot of our drama and a lot of the tension and beauty of being human. We're both physical and spiritual. We're like animals and we're like angels. We're very much of the earth and we're like other animals. That's now coming from the dust of the earth, as Genesis puts it, in not scientific language, but poetic language, but making much the same point that we're of the earth. Good. And we should never forget that. But at the same time, we're more than animals. There's a qualitative difference between even the highest of the animals who are simply of the earth and us who are of the earth. But we also have, and here's that lovely idea, the Ruach Adonai, the breath of the Lord, breathing into us what? What makes us distinctively human. This is our mind, our wills, our freedom, our properly spiritual capacity. So Genesis says it here in poetic language of God breathing into us, and then we earthly animal things become a living being.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Quote, "Do not confuse altruism with kindness, goodwill, or respect for the rights of others. These are not primaries, but consequences, which, in fact, altruism makes impossible. The irreducible primary of altruism, the basic absolute, is self-sacrifice, which means self-immolation, self-abnegation, self-denial, self-destruction, which means the self as a standard of evil, the selfless as a standard of the good. Do not hide behind such superficialities as whether you should or should not give a dime to a beggar. That is not the issue. The issue is whether you do or do not have the right to exist without giving him that dime." Unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we pick up where we left off with the 33 strategies of war.
Chapter 17. Defeat them in detail. The divide and conquer strategy. When you look at your enemies, do not be intimidated by their appearance. Instead, look at the parts that make up the whole. By separating the parts, sowing dissension and division from within, you can weaken and bring down even the most formidable foe. In setting up your attack, work on their minds to create internal conflict. Look for the joints and links, the things that connect the people in a group or connect one group to another. Division is weakness, and the joints are the weakest part of any structure. When you are facing troubles or enemies, turn a large problem into small, eminently defeatable parts. The central position. One day in early August of 490 BC, the citizens of Athens received word that a massive Persian fleet had just landed some 24 miles to the north, along the coastal plains of Marathon. A mood of doom quickly spread. Every Athenian knew Persia's intentions: to capture their city, destroy its young democracy, and restore a former tyrant, Hippias, to the throne, and sell many of its citizens into slavery. Some 8 years earlier, Athens had sent ships to support the Greek cities of Asia Minor in a rebellion against King Darius, ruler of the Persian Empire. The Athenians had sailed home after a few battles. They soon saw that this business was hopeless, but they had participated in burning down the city of Sardis, an unforgivable outrage, and Darius wanted revenge. The Athenians' predicament seemed desperate. The Persian army was enormous, some 80,000 men strong, transported by hundreds of ships. It had excellent cavalry and the best archers in the world. The Athenians, meanwhile, had only infantry, some 10,000 strong. They had sent a runner to Sparta urgently requesting reinforcements, but the Spartans were celebrating their moon festival, and it was taboo to fight during such a time. They would send troops as soon as they could, within a week, but that would probably be too late. Meanwhile, a group of Persian sympathizers within Athens, mostly from wealthy families, despised the democracy, looked forward to Hippias's return, and were doing their best to sow dissension and betray the city from within. Not only would the Athenians have to fight the Persians alone, but they were divided into factions among themselves. The leaders of democratic Athens gathered to discuss the alternatives, all of which seemed bad. The majority argued for concentrating the Athenian forces outside the city in a defensive cordon. There they could wait to fight the Persians on terrain they knew well. The Persian army, however, was large enough to surround the city by both land and sea, choking it off with a blockade. So one leader, Miltiades, made a very different proposal: to march the entire Athenian army immediately toward Marathon, to a place where the road to Athens passed through a narrow pass along the coast. That would leave Athens itself unprotected. In trying to block the Persian advance on land, it would open itself to an attack by sea. But Miltiades argued that occupying the pass was the only way to avoid being surrounded. He had fought the Persians in Asia Minor and was the Athenians' most experienced soldier. The leaders voted for his plan. And so, a few days later, the 10,000 Athenian infantrymen began the march north, slaves carrying their heavy body armor, mules and donkeys transporting their food. When they reached the pass, looking down on the plains of Marathon, their hearts sank. As far as the eye could see, the long strip of land was filled with tents, horses, and soldiers from all over the Persian Empire. Ships cluttered the coast. For several days, neither side moved. The Athenians had no choice but to hold their position. Without cavalry and hopelessly outnumbered, how could they do battle at Marathon? If enough time went by, perhaps the Spartans would arrive as reinforcements. But what were the Persians waiting for? Before dawn on August 12th, some Greek scouts, ostensibly working for the Persians, slipped across to the Athenian side and reported startling news. Under cover of darkness, the Persians had just sailed for the Bay of Phaleron outside Athens, taking most of their cavalry with them and leaving a holding force of some 15,000 soldiers in the plains of Marathon. They would take Athens from the sea, then march north, squeezing the Athenian army at Marathon between two larger forces. Of the Athenian army's 11 commanders, Miltiades alone seemed calm, even relieved. This was their opportunity. As the sun was getting ready to rise, he argued for an immediate attack on the Persians at Marathon. Some of the other commanders resisted this idea. The enemy still had more men, some cavalry, and plenty of archers. Better to wait for the Spartans, who would surely arrive soon. But Miltiades countered that the Persians had divided their forces. He had fought them before and knew that the Greek infantryman was superior in discipline and spirit. The Persians at Marathon now only slightly outnumbered the Greeks. They could fight them and win. Meanwhile, even with a good wind, it would take the Persian ships 10 to 12 hours to round the coast and arrive at the Bay of Phaleron. Then they would need more time to disembark the troops and horses. If the Athenians defeated the Persians at Marathon quickly, they would have just enough time to run back to Athens and defend the city the same day. If instead they opted to wait, the Spartans might never arrive. The Persians would surround them, and more ominously, the Persian sympathizers within Athens would probably betray the city from within and open its walls to the barbarians. It was now or never. By a vote of 6-5, the commanders decided to attack at dawn. At 6 in the morning, the Athenians began their charge. A hail of arrows from the Persian archers rained down on them, but they closed in on the enemy so quickly that the battle now had to be fought hand to hand. And, as Miltiades had foreseen, in close combat the Athenians were superior. They pushed the Persians back into the marshes at the north end of the plain, where thousands drowned. The waters reddened with blood. By 9 in the morning, the Athenians had control of the plains, having lost fewer than 200 men. Although emotionally spent by this battle, the Athenians now had only around 7 hours to make the 24 miles back to Athens in time to stop the Persians. There was simply no time to rest. They ran as fast as their feet could take them, loaded down in their heavy armor, impelled by the thought of the imminent dangers facing their families and fellow citizens. By 4 in the afternoon, the fastest among them had straggled to a point overlooking the Bay of Phaleron. The rest soon followed. Within a matter of minutes after their arrival, the Persian fleet sailed into the bay to see a most unwelcome sight. Thousands of Athenian soldiers, caked in dust and blood, standing shoulder to shoulder to fight the landing. The Persians rode at anchor for a few hours, then headed out to sea, returning home. Athens was saved. Interpretation. The victory at Marathon and race to Athens were perhaps the most decisive moments in Athenian history. Had the soldiers not come in time, the Persians would have taken the city, then certainly all of Greece, and eventually they would have expanded throughout the Mediterranean, for no other power in existence at the time could have stopped them. History would have been altered irrevocably. Miltiades' plan worked by the narrowest of margins, but it was based on sound and timeless principles. When a powerful foe attacks you in strength, threatening your ability to advance and take the initiative, you must work to make the enemy divide its forces and then defeat these smaller forces one by one. In detail, as the military say. The key to Miltiades' strategy was his intuition to take the battle to Marathon. By placing himself at the pass that led to Athens, he occupied the central position in the war instead of the southern periphery. With the entire army holding the pass, the Persians would have a bloody time forcing their way through. So they decided to divide their forces before the Spartan reinforcements arrived. Once divided, and with their cavalry diluted, they lost their advantage and the central position from which they could dominate the war. For the Athenians, it was imperative to fight the smallest force first, the one they faced at Marathon. That done, and having taken the central position, they had the shorter route to Athens, while the invaders had to round the coast. Arriving first at Phaleron, the Athenians allowed no safe place to disembark. The Persians could have returned to Marathon, but the arrival of the bloodied Athenian soldiers from the north must have told them they had already lost the battle there, and their spirits were broken. Retreat was the only option.
And that was the first part of Chapter 17, Defeat Them in Detail, from the 33 Strategies of War, from Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican, because President Biden is not only the face of the country, the leader of the country, but he is the titular head of the Democrat Party. And what he does reflects on the Democrat Party and everybody in it. So right now, the Democrat Party is a party that wanders around not knowing where it's going, what it's doing, or what it's saying. It is brain-addled. And you, as a voter, deserve better. That's why you need to vote Republican. Back in a minute. Thank you. Our educational system is failing because subversives have successfully claimed that history is written by the winners. This leaves the psychological impression that history is a matter of politics and not a matter of scholarship. And since all academic subjects have a history, they are now all under socio-political pressure. This makes our educational system unreliable, and our children suffer as a result. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and Queer Strippers in Elementary Schools are two examples of the subversives' use of our educational system as a tool to further their aims. To reestablish excellence in our educational system, we must reemphasize the scholarship involved in all subjects, but particularly in history. Back in a minute. Thank you. So, I was going to call him Speaker McConnell. No, it's ersatz leader. I have a hard time calling Mitch McConnell a leader in any way, shape, or form. Perhaps administratively, that he shuffles paperwork or something, but he's stepping down. Thank goodness. Better late than never. He should have done this a long time ago. He's a Trump hater, and he's got to go. And that's what you need to know about this. This is evidence that the old regime is finally, it's crumbling away, it's falling away. The neocons are going away, and neoconism is dead. It's dead. Long live Trumpism. And that's what this is all about. Mitch McConnell knows that he will have little or no influence in the Trump administration that is coming. So he's out. Just like there's about 5 or 6 or 8 Republicans have announced they're not going to run for office in November. They're not going to run for re-election because they're Trump haters. This is almost like 2008, except they have the decency to leave now rather than wait until the midterms to screw everybody. Because that's what they did. Remember, everything that we've got going on now with the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the Senate is where the Republicans are in the minority and very, very slim majority in the House, and that's because it started in 2018 when 15 Republicans threw a temper tantrum and retired and decided that they were not going to run for re-election, handing the House over to Nancy Pelosi, and the disaster that has been for the past 6 years. So that's the fault of the Republicans. Everything that's going bad in this country can be traced to the Republicans and the Republican Party. And as a matter of fact, I think it was Ronna McDaniel that started her tenure as the RNC chairman right around the same time. So all of this can be laid at the Republican doorstep. Democrats have simply done what Democrats do, especially as they've become more radicalized. So they bear some direct responsibility, but if Republicans are supposed to be bulwarks against socialism, they have failed, and they have done so deliberately. Both Ronna McDaniel and the Senate so-called majority, so-called leader, or minority leader, whatever he wants to call himself, were so busy sticking their thumb in the eye of Donald Trump that they screwed up the Senate majority and the House majority as well. And so now this is where Hugh Hewitt comes in. Hugh Hewitt thinks that McConnell is one of the best speakers we've ever had, and he went on some radio show or TV show yesterday to talk about this. What a swell guy that Mitch McConnell was. But Hugh Hewitt is a Trump hater. He's always been a Trump hater. The thing about Hugh Hewitt is he's smarter about it than Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck is and was a moron. Glenn Beck was not satisfied with having a nice, successful program. He decided to go out and hang a kick me sign on his back by announcing that he hates Donald Trump so much that he's going to go out and go on a hunger strike. Well, if you noticed, Mr. Beck is about 50 pounds heavier today than he was when he started his strike, so I guess that didn't work. Plus, he almost lost his entire business. Apparently, if the rumors are correct, about 50% of his audience left him, and he was stunned, and he should have been. But he was an overt Trump hater. Hugh Hewitt learned that lesson, and so he keeps his Trump hating on the down low. And one of the ways he expresses his contempt for Donald Trump is by supporting people like Mitch McConnell. So don't forget it. Back in a minute. Thank you. So more news on Biden, that apparently President Biden uses cue cards even when he's in private meetings. So he has these closed-door meetings with members of Congress. He has cue cards. And if you talk about things that are not on his cue cards, he can't deal with it. He can't process the information. He can only regurgitate whatever's on cue cards. So, and then on Varney and Company, they're asking, the questions about, does anybody believe he can go for another 4 years? And again, like I said, I firmly believe that the Democrats see the presidency differently, that the presidency is a cooperative effort, that there isn't a president, but that there is a team of presidents that includes his cabinets and his advisors, etc., and that in this particular case, Joe Biden is just simply a figurehead. He's just the face of the administration. Now, they give him cue cards and whatnot because they would like him to put the best face forward when he is out in public or even in private situations. But at the end of the day, he's just one small part of the administration. That's the way they look at it, is this is the Biden administration, not the Biden presidency. And this is one of the reasons they don't like Trump. Trump takes over, it's going to be the way it should be, the way the Constitution says it should be, and that is that the president is the one that actually runs the federal government, because that's who we elected. We didn't elect Biden's sister. We didn't elect his wife. We didn't elect his advisors. In a manner of speaking, we didn't elect his cabinet either. All the people that are part of his team that are helping to make decisions, we didn't vote for those people. So they get, again, like a dictatorship where they get to exercise authority without having to accept responsibility. Because basically that's what goes on. If the people around him say, well, let's leave the border wide open so we can save Social Security, who's going to take the gaff for that? President Biden. Not his wife, not his sister, not his advisors. Nobody even knows they exist. But they have influence, larger and larger influence, I would imagine, and so they're able to exercise authority and power. But since it's the face of the administration is Joe Biden, Joe's the one that has to take the criticisms. He's the one that has to suffer the slings and arrows when things go wrong. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we'll pick up where we left off with Inside Delta Force.
It was the mid-'80s, and the years were passing so rapidly, and we were so busy, it was hard to keep up with where my mates were in the world. Some guys were off by themselves, some were in two-man elements, and some were in four-man teams deployed in different spots of the globe plying our trade. New men came into the unit, and older ones fell away. I had the great opportunity to attend Spanish language school, and what a boon that was. My street Spanish had always been just good enough to get me into trouble, and you can imagine the content of the phrases I had learned from my Puerto Rican and Chicano friends. Instead of sending us to the Defense Language Institute, DLI, in Monterey, California, the unit hired an instructor, and a dozen of us took the DLI course at Fort Bragg. By the second month, I was starting to dream in Spanish, and after that, class was a pure delight. After graduating from the 6-month course, I had a pretty good handle on the language, and Latin America became my primary area of responsibility, with the Middle East as my secondary. It was just in time, too, because Central America had become one of our main stomping grounds. In fact, I had the good luck to have a wonderfully boring and successful mission down there. I led a double team, 2 4-man teams, to Guatemala on a mission to prevent one of the local guerrilla groups from blowing up the American embassy in Guatemala City. We had learned that the group wanted to commemorate their upcoming anniversary in a spectacular manner, one that would simultaneously bring them great prestige and enhance their recruiting effort. Naturally, the guerrillas believed the most festive way to celebrate the occasion was to blast the U.S. Embassy into the stratosphere. I made certain that the guerrilla surveillance teams saw us, and that they could also see the preparations we were making to greet them, and make their lives even more exciting should they choose to follow through with their plans. When we had positively identified the guerrilla observation points, we held up signs in Spanish telling them we intended to give them a warm welcome if they visited us, and that in addition to the unpleasantries they could see, there was a lot here that they couldn't. Then we posted politely worded signs telling them we would appreciate it if they would celebrate their fiesta somewhere else. After a couple of days, we became friendly enough with the guerrilla observation teams to exchange comradely waves to one another, we from our rooftop positions and they from their observation points around the embassy. A day later, the guerrilla surveillance disappeared. We stayed at the embassy for an additional week after their anniversary had passed, and then posted a sign on the embassy roof saying, "Thanks for the hospitality." We said our goodbyes to the ambassador and the RSO and returned to Fort Bragg. The worst part of the mission had been standing on the roof of the embassy all night every night. Not only was it cold up there, but right next door, on the upwind side of the embassy, was the most fabulous steakhouse in the world. Every night, the delicious aroma of grass-fed Guatemalan beef grilled over charcoal on the restaurant front porch wafted in the night breeze straight to our flaring nostrils in our rooftop outpost. So close, yet so far away. Now that's torture. The mission was a success, not one that makes for a hair-raising story, but the type of counter-terrorist operation that I call a real success, a preventive success. No one was hurt, no lives or property were lost, and now, a couple of decades later, guerrillas and Delta alike are able to realize there was nothing really so important about blowing up that embassy anyway. Guerrilla groups are indigenous, not only to Latin America, but to other parts of the world as well. And we had been busy in those other places too. Quietly busy in small ways, but busy nonetheless. A few years earlier than my Guatemalan vacation, Don Feeney had been busy in one of those other places. He and his team had been sent on a very hush-hush mission to train a counter-terrorist force for the Sudanese army. Then, as now, Sudan was a country we wouldn't admit to having direct dealings with. But someone in the State Department or CIA thought that if we gave them a little secret training assistance, it might open the door slightly for some sort of cozy back porch socializing. So Donnie and his mates were dispatched to build and train a Sudanese CT force. Never mind that common sense said that such a unit would probably be used as a tool of oppression by the military government of Sudan. The Sudanese had nothing. No ranges, no equipment, and no ammo. Feeney and his guys had to start from the ground up, but within a few months they had created a pretty good little force. Of course, you have to remember one thing. Good is a relative term. One of the team members, Fred Brandy, was in charge of constructing the range and the shooting house, and by the very nature of the project, he had been forced to learn Arabic. He came back from the mission with a handwritten dictionary and an Arabic vocabulary of over 1,000 words. Fred went on to attend the Arabic course at DLI and is one of the few gringos I've ever known who is perfectly fluent in the language. Almost as soon as the team returned from their little vacation in the desert, they were put on alert. A group of American missionaries had been captured by a separatist guerrilla group and were being held in a village near the southern border with Uganda. The U.S. Embassy demanded help, but Washington said the rescue force had to be small. We didn't want to let on that we were having any sort of relationship with the government of Sudan. So, much like the old Texas Rangers saw of one riot, one ranger, we sent one operator. Feeney, you trained him, now go lead him. Don was dispatched to help get the Americans back. When he arrived in country, he was pleased and surprised to see that the CT force was still intact. When we built the same type of force for the Egyptians, someone in power convinced President Mubarak that the group was more of a threat than anything else, and the members we trained were scattered throughout the Egyptian military. That decision was to bear some bitter fruit just a few years later. Donnie's main problem was centered in the American embassy. For some reason or another, the CIA chief of station and his two henchmen were trying to convince the ambassador that their clients, a certain brigade in the Sudanese army, should be the ones to rescue the missionaries. Donnie told the ambassador that if the regular army made the attempt, at best the operation would be exceedingly slow, and at worst, the guerrillas would probably kill their captives and slip across the border. If the CT force was used instead, Donnie believed they stood a good chance of getting the prisoners back alive. The ambassador made his decision. Feeney, go get them and bring them back. From that point forward, the little CIA clan did everything it possibly could to foul the mission. They muddied the command relationship within the Sudanese army and tried to block the CT force from gaining use of the one airplane in the military that was capable of reaching the crisis area. But if there's one thing Don Feeney knows, it's street fighting, and he was able to push aside the obstacles the chief of station tried to put in his path. The rescue force was able to get their hands on the one C-130 in the Sudanese Air Force. Fortunately, there was an airstrip less than half a mile from the small village where the captives were being held. Donnie knew the area well, and so did the members of the CT force. Since they wanted to make the hit the next morning, the 40 members of the assault force weren't able to conduct full-scale rehearsals. So Donnie led them through walkthroughs of the attack drawn with chalk on the runway of the airfield. Once he was satisfied everyone knew his place and his task in the mission, Donnie was ready to go. He loaded his force, some food and water, some rudimentary medical supplies he had scrounged up, and 3 jeeps mounting 50 caliber machine guns aboard the C-130 for the 1,000-mile flight to a staging base less than 20 miles from the crisis point. They would hit the guerrilla camp just as daylight was breaking, a time of the day known in military parlance as BMNT, beginning of morning nautical twilight. In common speak, this is known as that time of the morning when you can just start to see stuff. The C-130 hit the runway just as daylight spread across the dusty African landscape. The 3 gun jeeps, absolutely covered with Sudanese commandos, roared out of the plane and up the dusty track to a small hill about 150 meters to the west of the guerrilla camp. The machine guns opened fire on the camp's main buildings, while Donnie led the ground force on a sweep of the southern half of the village. The handful of guerrillas who were awake fired just a few shots before they threw down their weapons and fled into the bush. The rest of the outfit woke up to the fusillade of those 350 caliber machine guns and quickly decided to follow their buddies in search of a safer place. The machine guns continued to fire for a few more minutes, just to let the guerrillas know the commandos were really serious about the affair, and then displaced forward and occupied the buildings the guerrillas had so hastily deserted. Donnie and his maneuver element found the missionaries alive and well in a hut in the southern quarter of the village. The assault had gone perfectly, easier, in fact, than the walkthrough the day before. The CT force took no casualties, and the guerrillas had been so fleet of foot they had lost only 4 men. While Donnie and the Sudanese commander were rounding up the unit and the hostages for the flight back out, the boys from the CIA arrived by plane to have a look at what had taken place. As soon as he saw them, Donnie said, he knew what was up. Since they didn't have to fool with troops or hostages, and they had a faster plane to boot, the CIA boys were going to hustle back to Khartoum and spin the tale to grab as much credit as possible for themselves. The only reason I knew about the operation is that I had been talking to Donnie throughout the mission on our new satellite radio system. We stayed in contact just in case something went wrong and we had to go find Don. That way, we would at least know his last location and have a place to begin the search. But my old buddy, the Artful Dodger, survived once again and returned home to a regular non-welcome. He was told to never say anything about being in Sudan, and that was the end of that. He did have one important souvenir of the rescue. The missionaries gave him a Bible with their signatures and their thanks. And as Donnie says, that's better than any kind of official recognition. As I have said previously, Central America was a place of overwhelming political turmoil, and no spot was more volatile than the small country of El Salvador. That's especially ironic when you realize that the country's name means the Savior. El Salvador has a centuries-old tradition of political violence and civil war. It has a population density greater than that of India, and traditionally has been ruled by a small handful of families who believed that the only way they could stay at the top of the heap was to keep a firm and, when necessary, brutal foot on the neck of the lesser beings of the population. In the 1980s, Delta Force was hip-deep in that bellicose little nation as our country tried to help put a lid on the discontent with the status quo. It was a difficult job. The Army of El Salvador was poorly equipped, poorly organized, and poorly led. The officer corps was about as corrupt as they could possibly be. They had convinced themselves that if they just stalled long enough, President Reagan would commit U.S. ground troops and do their job for them. And though they were reluctant in taking on the main revolutionary group, the FMLN, Farabundo Martí National Liberation, they had no qualms when it came to murdering priests, nuns, and poor villagers. As I said, it would prove to be a difficult job. Some of us trained their special operations forces, doing our best to teach them that the indiscriminate killing of campesinos only creates guerrillas. To this day, I've met only 4 officers of Latin American armies who genuinely understood that concept. Other operators were involved in leading weapons interdiction missions along the borders. Working in cooperation with the Honduran authorities, we had been fairly successful in choking off the supply of arms coming overland from Nicaragua, and that had forced the Nicaraguans to take to the water in an effort to keep their Salvadoran comrades supplied with the necessities of insurrection. If you look at a map of the Pacific coast of Central America, you will see the Gulf of Fonseca, a beautiful stretch of water bordered by El Salvador on the west, Honduras on the north, and Nicaragua to the east. Centered in the northern portion of the Gulf is the ancient volcanic mountain that constitutes Tiger Island. We had a look and listen station atop the mountain peak of the island, and from that vantage point, we were able to watch the entire Gulf of Fonseca and the surrounding land with a keen and critical eye. And at night, with assistance provided by the watchers on Tiger Island, we swept the waters of the Gulf clean of gun-smuggling boat traffic. My old compadre, Andre Benavides, was in charge of the counter-smuggling operation. If you're wondering why an American headed the program instead of one of the locals, the answer is simple. The Salvadorans couldn't trust their own people not to confiscate a boatload of weapons, kill the smugglers, and then sell the guns and the boat that carried them. But with an American present to stay on top of things, the locals would do a pretty good job. Andre's fleet of interceptors consisted of 3 27-foot Boston whalers, each one mounting an M60 machine gun and carrying a crew of 4 men. Andre had trained his small navy quite well. They were able to navigate in formation at night wearing night vision goggles, could fire their weapons accurately, and could communicate by radio without babbling like a bunch of old maids. No mean feat in itself. And once they put to sea, they did a landslide business. For 2 weeks, they had a marvelous time. Following navigational directions from the outpost on Tiger Island, they picked up arms-laden boats almost every night. Andre devised a simple and effective tactic that worked like a Swiss watch. When the radar station picked up a target, Andre would position his fleet in an open V formation in front of the approaching boat. When the smuggler was in the jaws of the V, the 3 boats would hit him simultaneously with their spotlights, and Andre would announce over the bullhorn that the pleasure cruise was over. Surrounded on all sides, the boat captains surrendered every time, except one. It was a pitch-black night, and the Gulf was kicking up her heels. The water was very choppy, with waves running about 4 to 5 feet. Shortly after midnight, they got a call from Tiger Island that a target was approaching. Andre positioned his group and set the trap. Before long, they could see the boat snaking his way through the waves, oblivious to the nets strung in front of him. When everything was perfect, Andre called "now" over the radio, and the spotlights from his 3 boats pinned the interloper from 3 converging directions. This particular smuggler then did the unthinkable. He spun his boat around in an evasive maneuver, hit the throttle, and tried to peel those damn lights off his back. Andre yelled one time for the boat to halt, and then let him have a burst of machine gun fire. The stream of bullets hit the boat at the waterline and walked up its side just in front of the pilot. At the blast from the machine gun, the engine went dead and the pilot toppled over into the bottom of the boat. Andre and his small fleet closed in to take possession of the smuggler's craft before it could sink. The boat was an ocean-going cayuco, a 30-foot vessel made from a giant tropical hardwood log, carefully hollowed out and precisely shaped. These kinds of boats have been in use for centuries, and until fairly recent times were propelled only with oars and sails. Now, most cayucos mounted outboard motors. Some of the larger ones, like the one Andre encountered, even boast a small inboard diesel engine. Andre raced up alongside the cayuco. Just as the two boats came gunwale to gunwale, the smuggler popped up from the bottom of the boat like a jack-in-the-box, spitting mad. "Why did you shoot me?" he shouted at Andre. Andre was so surprised, he snapped back just as quickly. "Why didn't you stop when I told you to?" The smuggler, a weather-beaten old man, answered, "I thought you were pirates. I'm carrying a valuable commodity." Andre quickly checked the cayuco to see how much water she was taking on. He was amazed to see that the bullets he had fired at a range of less than 30 meters had not even penetrated the hull of the boat. After verifying that the boat was indeed carrying a load of weapons and ammunition, he attempted a serious talk with the composed and quite nonchalant captain. "Abuelo, why are you doing this thing? Why do you put yourself at such risk to carry weapons to a people you do not even know? Do you not realize that what you are doing is very dangerous?" The old man eyed Andre calmly for a few seconds before he answered, "Young gentleman, do you not know what is going on in my country? The times, they are bad, and they were bad before, during the years of the samosas. But at least then, if you were quiet, and you did not meddle in politics, and you voted the way the village alcalde, mayor, told you to vote, you could live relatively unmolested. But today everything is politics in Nicaragua. One is no longer allowed the luxury to be quiet. Now one must be militant. One must be a revolutionary. One must strike a blow against imperialism. One must act to show solidarity with the revolution. It is required of us. So when an important and powerful man from Managua comes to my village and says, 'Citizens, you are fishermen and you know these waters. Now you will have the glorious opportunity to aid our valiant comrades in El Salvador in their struggles against the forces of the capitalist imperialists. Your village will be allowed to make 5 voyages to carry liberation supplies to our friends across the bay.' Someone had to do it, and do it without question. So I volunteered to be the one to make the trips. I did not want my sons, or the sons of my brothers, or any of the other young men in my village to make such a dangerous trip. If someone is to perish or be captured and sent to prison, then let it be me. I am an old man. My wife is dead, and there is no longer anyone who depends on me for food or a father's protection. My loss would account for little, and I would soon be forgotten. And that, young man, is why I am doing this thing." Andre asked the old man how many trips he had made, and was surprised to hear that this was the 5th and final trip. He had elected a direct crossing this time because it was a moonless night. On the other occasions, he had stood well out to sea and made a looping, roundabout approach to the Salvadoran coast. That accounted for his previous ability to avoid Andre and his men. Now Andre was in a quandary. This was the first civilian they had captured, and Andre really didn't want to turn him over to the Salvadorans. They were notoriously brutal with prisoners. But if he confiscated and brought in the old man's weapons, Andre would have to account for the boat and the captain. Andre had a huddle with the crewmen of his little fleet. After an extended conversation with his men, he turned back to the old fisherman. "Viejo, if I return you to your home, will you and your village have to do this again? Will you have to make other trips like this?" The old man answered slowly, "I cannot say either yes or no with certainty. The man from Managua says that with these 5 trips, our village will have met its quota. Our alcalde seems to think this is true. But we are dealing with a government, and there is little truth in any government, only appetite for the things it wants. So, will I have to do this again? I do not know. Andre made his decision. Father, we are going to throw this stuff overboard, and then you are going to go home. Travel slowly so that you return to your village at the usual hour. Tell no one of our encounter. If you are asked, just say that you made your delivery as ordered. If you are told that the people on the Salvadoran side never received the material, you are to reply that they are notorious thieves and they are probably keeping the shipment to sell for themselves. Now return to your people, and when these bad times are over, I will come to visit you in your village. Go, and God go with you. The old man nodded to Andre and his men in thankful farewell, cranked the engine of his boat, and disappeared into the darkness. Andre bought the silence of his crew members with a generous bribe, and that was that. Or so he hoped, because he ran the risk of almost certain court-martial if the tale of what really happened ever leaked out. But the secret held, and just a few years after the demise of the Sandinista regime, Andre kept his promise to the old fisherman. During a trip to Central America, he made a side tour to the old man's village on the Nicaraguan coast. He found a quiet, sleepy fishing village full of the old captain's descendants and relatives. But alas, the old man had died some years before. Andre told the people of the village who he was and how he had met their kinsmen. They were amazed at the tale, but not at the actions of that remarkable old man. He had been known for his quiet courage, they said, and he had protected his people and his village all his life. They were not surprised that a stranger, even one he had met as an enemy, at night on the waters of the Gulf, would recognize what a special man he was and wish to visit him again. Andre stayed for 2 days with those good and kind people. He visited the old man's grave and was happier than ever for his decision that night so long ago to send that good man home.
And that was Inside Delta Force by Eric L. Haney, Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.